Hi, it's Pastor Andy, and we are ready for our Friday preview. In the month of December, we are turning to Romans chapter 6, and this week we are looking at verses 1 through 7. Now, in reality, I wish we could cover all of Romans chapter 6 this week, but we can't. Uh, I don't think I could do that even if I tried. You know me well enough by now, probably. But I really wish I could get through verse 14 because there's a lot of overlap in the first 14 verses. Some of what we're going to talk about next week kind of ties together what we're talking about this week. Of course, that was true in Romans chapter 5 as well, and in Romans chapter 4, etc. So Paul is building an argument. And it's very difficult to break that argument up in different places, but for the sake of trying to develop enough of an understanding that we can do something with that understanding is important. Now, I realize in the first 5 chapters, there has been a lot of, especially the first 4, there's been a lot of justification, and we got into grace a little bit in chapter 5. And so there hasn't been a lot of application, but we are now going to begin to ask some questions. And Paul is going to begin to answer some questions that are questions that people ask all the time. For instance, in verse 20 of chapter 5, which we saw 2 weeks ago, Paul makes this statement that grace abounds all the more. I talked about superabounding, if you remember, that when sin increases, grace increases even more. So the question that begins chapter 6 is, should we sin more? I mean, if grace is going to continue to grow, if the grace of God can continue to grow, then wouldn't we want it to continue to grow? And therefore, to make that happen, let's sin even more. Well, maybe or maybe not. That's a reasonable question. I would say not. But here's the question that Paul basically asks in response. Can a dead person sin? No. A dead person can't do anything, right? Well, what Paul is making the argument here in Romans chapter 6 is that if we have given our life to Christ, that is, if we are dead in Christ, if we have taken away ourselves to give our lives to Christ, then we are dead. And if we are dead, then we can no longer sin because Christ did not sin. Christ, now being dead and raised from the dead, having been dead and raised from the dead, does not sin as he sits at the right hand of the Father. Hebrews 4:15 tells us that he was tempted in every way and yet was without sin while he was on the earth. So if we have died to ourselves, then we can no longer sin, at least not continue in sin, which is the next question. Is it possible to sin? Or is Paul saying that we should not sin at all any longer? Now, there might be some people that say, well, I've become a Christian and so I cannot sin anymore. I'm not here to judge. I'm just saying that's probably a lie. And according to the Bible, that is a sin. The Bible doesn't say that we cannot sin. In fact, what Romans chapter 6 is going to help us understand is that sin still exists for the Christian. Sin can still tempt us. But the difference is that it is no longer our master. It no longer has dominion. It no longer rules. Why? Because of that grace that superabounds. So as a Christian, as a follower of Christ, as someone who is learning to become more like Christ, because we have died in him, then we should not want to sin. We should want to become more like him, to not sin any longer. But when we fail, when we still give in to our fleshly desires, when we still fall to that temptation, God's grace superabounds. That is a wonderful message of hope for all of us. For those who don't know Christ, that grace superabounds, but we should not abuse it. For those of us who fall even when we don't want to fall and we want to become more like Christ, that God's grace covers us. It's a great message. That's where we begin this week in Romans chapter 6. Again, verses 1 through 7. I'll see you Sunday.